Sound okay? Yeah, first of all, well, it's still in my head, otherwise I'm going to be absolutely destroyed by the other members of the committee. To remind you to, if you haven't filled in the attendance sheet, if you would please do so. And they're on either side. And I noticed yesterday people put their names in, but they didn't put their addresses or email addresses in. So if you could please make sure that you do so. This is the final session of the school, and I think it has been a fairly successful one. This session is certainly extremely topical, and we have a speaker who is really has been extremely, I've found extremely informative in relation to what is going on in Ukraine. But my main purpose is to thank Catherine Connolly, who is here at the front. And she wanted to be up on the wanted to be up on the platform, but it's just because of the circumstances. Catherine has been a great friend of the school over the years. She has chaired sessions, she's spoken at sessions, and she's somebody who you can ring up if you're, if you need someone who is more than adequately equipped to fill the role of chair or speaker. We are extremely grateful to her for being here, and I must say that we are pleased to have our connections with her over the years. I just discovered there she is a patron of the People's Movement in terms of which I hadn't appreciated, and in terms of the militarisation process in the EU. The People's Movement has, for the last number of years, been holding a picket outside the Dáil. And again, she has come out and she has joined us and she has participated in those pickets. So I don't know, do you want me, do you want to just hand over to Philip, and then we'll have the discussion. We'll put up the screen. Speakers will get up onto up on the platform, and then Catherine can do her thing. Philip, you start.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Catherine, for agreeing to. Thank you, Catherine, for agreeing to chair this, because it might be a bit robust later. We'll see how it goes. We should have a map of Ukraine up, if possible. I would just say I'm not a fan of war, but it's a fact of life. In fact, it's probably the second favourite and oldest activity of the human race, unfortunately. I would also, can we get the map up? I would also say...
And the microphone, please use the microphone.
Oh, okay. I would also say that there are many, many countries, hundreds of countries in the world, and I defy anyone to identify a single boundary across the world that was not determined by violent conflict. I would also say that some things that I'll say will probably be controversial. I know my views, while they're shared by some people, would certainly not be majority views of the Irish public at the moment. maybe in time they will inform those views. I'm going to try and establish a few things in the course of my paper, and I'll try and stick to facts and avoid the inevitable emotion that the awfulness of war can incite. The war in Ukraine was deliberately brought about by Western policy, which for Russia created an existential crisis to which it had to respond. A Western incited conflict began in 2014 and was responded to by Russia eventually with the special military operation of February 2022. Western Ukrainian nationalists were drawn into this conflict and joined in for what are really unachievable goals, and in doing so are in danger of bringing about the total destruction of Ukraine. There were attempts after the start of this special military operation, and I'll explain why I use that term, in March and April 2022 to bring an end to the conflict, which was seen at that time as a political conflict. And this was through negotiations, which were then aborted by Western intervention at the start of April 2022. And the war thereafter assumed a very different form and became a fuller war in the full meaning of the term. Though not completely, as I'll also explain. And what we had, as an astonished expert at the Royal United Services Institute put it, was the return of industrial warfare. People were used to these anti-insurgency wars in the Middle East, where you bring overwhelming power to bear on third world armies and peoples. That's what people had come to think war was about. But suddenly we were back to industrial warfare, which involves not only military capability, but the entire industrial base on which it is being carried out. Unfortunately, I believe at this stage that because of the nature of the Ukrainian government and its demands, war, and if they are not dropped, war will continue until the collapse of Ukraine. Unfortunately, also, I think the US, the major player in this, and as we know, if they wanted a move by the US, could stop this war in a matter of days. But it has no incentive to end it, and no incentive to negotiate, because by its own definition of what the war is about, this is an opportunity to weaken Russia, which it has defined as a systemic enemy, and also, which is not so often articulated but sometimes comes true, but also to break the gradual integration that was going on economically between Western Europe and the Eurasian continent, if you like. So what will be the outcome of this war, of this conflict? I think for Ukraine at the moment, it looks very grim indeed, and it could be the reduction of Ukraine to a wrecked and dysfunctional rump state. And of no less importance is that this is a global conflict. It is not a local conflict to be understood in local national terms. It is a global conflict, and what it signifies is the end of what we might call the unipolar moment that went from 1991 to 2021, when there was one superpower in the world and it sought to shape the entire world in its image or in the likeness which it wanted to bestow on it. It is the end of the unipolar world. I suppose the clearest indication of that has been the vast swathes of the world, representing nearly half the population of the globe, who refused to go along with Western policy on the war while they didn't like the war or its implications. And also, that was illustrated most cogently in the emergence of China as a peacemaker in the Middle East and the emergence of BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China economic, it's not, I think bloc is the wrong word, but the economic entity, and its sudden expansion by 6 more states just in the last few weeks, and the setting up of a secretariat. These are momentous events of global importance. And just a final thing I'd say is this war need never have happened. Now I'll try and drill down into those various points and bring you along with my argument. The 3 major factors at the just before the special military operation was launched for the preceding 20 years was how the US had treated Russia and Ukraine since the end of the Cold War. Secondly, how Russia had seen its position since the end of the USSR. And thirdly, the development of Ukraine as a nation state. On the unipolar moment, during the Cold War, the US adopted a very reasonable and rational position in the world because it was dealing with a peer competitor, the Soviet Union. President Kennedy, just a few months before he died, or was assassinated, gave good expression to this sanity, if you like. He said, describing the global clash, the US-Soviet Union rivalry, he said, above all, while defending our vital national interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or a collective death wish of the world. That's the same position adopted during the Cold War. The unipolar world began with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the absolute disintegration of the Soviet Union. And this was, what happened then was the wildest dreams of the CIA come true. Okay. Francis Fukuyama, unfortunate name, but that's it, who was an American, despite the name, he's actually an American high-ranking professor, very integrated in the think tank world of American policymaking, wrote a famous book called The End of History and the Last Man. The world was going to become a liberal capitalist system in which the major human problem, like one big mall or shopping centre, and the one problem mankind would face would be boredom. And this thesis was taken very seriously, and a lot of people who might laugh at it now actually share what it says, but that the world is an ever-expanding world of liberal democracy, consumerism, cars, televisions. But unfortunately, and others had a more radical way of expressing it. They said it was the beginning of a new American century in which the United States would have full spectrum dominance. They would dominate in politics, in security, in the markets, in the media, in public opinion formation. And the US, on the basis of this incredible hubris, went on a rampage, destroying states at will. We all know the cases, I won't go over them. Mostly in the Muslim world, and for no particular reason other than to show what power it had. And these forever wars, as they came to be called, was a high point of the American century, which lasted between 1991 and 2016, when America used military power as the first option in foreign policy and saw it as the basic determinant of relationships between states. Obama called America the indispensable nation. Hillary Clinton spoke about American exceptionalism. Rules were for everybody else, but America wrote the rules and was not subject to them. this type of stuff was openly spoken about. And where did Ukraine come into all of this? Well, I can't pronounce his name. Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was a Secretary of State in the 90s. He wrote a famous book called The Chessboard in 1997. And he predicted that Russia's survival, because it was disintegrating at the time, depended on reintegrating Ukraine with it. And already in the 90s he proposed that something as what happened later at the Maidan Square in Kiev be carried out. And that this would generate a crisis for Russia similar to what Afghanistan had been for the USSR. So he wrote. And American policymakers like this think in terms of geostrategy, which goes back to two admirals, the British Admiral Mackinder and the American Admiral Mahan, who saw the world in terms of how it can be controlled by maritime power. Control of the oceans, and the heartland of the world is the Eurasian landmass, and this could be contained by being ringed around and strangled. It's also important that in the disintegration of the USSR and the emergence of Ukraine, American military strategists had one thing on their mind, and that was what would happen in Sebastopol. Sebastopol.
Could we get the glare off the map?
We can if you have a sound band or a lights band that can do it.
Okay, Sebastopol is the great Russian military port in Crimea. It was the key to what the Crimean War in the 1850s was about, and it's the key to what is really a new Crimean War of the 2020s, which is about control of the Black Sea. There were articles in Foreign Affairs, which is the leading journal of the US foreign policy establishment, which actually early in 2022 that the chance had now come to finally, after 300 years of trying, for Europe to eject Russia from Europe and push it back into Asia where it belongs. I'm not making this stuff up. And the key to doing that is taking the Black Sea from it. Okay. Now in all of these developments, along came Donald Trump, the big exception, and you had for a few years a relative peace interlude. He still did things like assassinated a major Iranian general and various other things, but he didn't start any new wars. But the rogue president was dispensed with, and as the Foreign Affairs magazine euphorically exclaimed, "America is back." We were back in business. And there was a great, and you can see it by reading Foreign Affairs over the subsequent 2 years, a great appetite for resuming interventions here, there and everywhere to make the world good again. Okay, so that's, if you like, my view of the American perspective of what the world was after the end of the Cold War. What about Russia? Well, the collapse of the USSR, Putin once called it the geopolitical catastrophe, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He also said, and I may as well say it now rather than another thing, he also said that anyone who had no nostalgia for the Soviet Union did not have a heart, but anyone who thought about restoring it did not have a mind. Okay? And at first, the Russian view of Ukrainians was brother Slavs. But in the 90s, Russia was wrecked by Yeltsin. Someone who's interesting to listen to on podcasts or read is Jeffrey Sachs, who played a big role in those transformation policies in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, and especially in Poland, and stabilizing the currency and bringing Poland into the international financial and economic system. Basically a Marshall Plan. And he proposed that this also be extended to Russia. And he says that the answer he got in Washington was an adamant no. Russia's going to sink. And instead what Russia got was what was called shock therapy. And I'm sure you're all aware of that. Russia was reduced by 1998 to IMF loans, to incredible poverty, standards of living collapsed. The life expectancy dropped from 75 to 55. It was a horrendous period for Russia. And eventually the answer was the emergence of Putin, who rolled back the chaotic democracy, if you like, of the Yeltsin years, which had just been an open system basically run by oligarchs. He reined in the oligarchs and reconstructed the social cohesion of the Russian state, and have totally flipped those United Nations Development Index figures around. At the Munich Security Conference in 2007, Putin caused quite a stir by saying there'd be no further expansion of NATO. This was a red line for Russia. Georgia and Ukraine could not join NATO. Now, it should be remembered that Putin was basically very open to the West initially. He actually proposed that NATO be restructured so that Russia could become part of it, and that Russia should eventually be part of the EU. Putin came out of the whole tradition of Western Russia, which sees itself as European. But following the war in Yugoslavia in '98 and the intervention by NATO there, Russia had supported the sanctions throughout the '90s against Iraq. The UN sanctions had supported the Gulf War when it was asked, but now all that began to change. In 2008, the following year, George W. Bush, who was still president, he said, "No one can dictate to NATO. It's an open door, and Georgia and Ukraine are welcome to join." When earlier this year, someone said, William Burns, who's the head of the CIA, but at one time was the US ambassador in Russia, when he pleaded with the Bush administration, "Niet means niet, no means no." That this red line is regarded by Russia as existential. And the same, There were several other incidences, like the events in Georgia in 2008, which were of a similar character, and if you want to ask about them, we can talk about them after. But essentially in 2008, Putin tested NATO by challenging it there and proving that its red lines it meant for real. It got as far as Tbilisi, but pulled back once the Georgian government basically stepped down from its position. And thereafter, after 2008, the West began to, especially the US, began to build up Ukraine. There was loads of NGOs went into the country to spread the word about establishing a liberal democracy, breaking with the autocracies of the East, and so forth. Burns said to Condoleezza Rice, "It is difficult to overestimate the strategic implications of offering NATO membership to Ukraine. It would create fertile ground for Russian interference in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Promise Ukraine NATO membership and there could be no doubt that Putin will resist." William Burns knew Russia very well. He spoke Russian, which is very unusual amongst the political elite in the US, and he had been ambassador there, as I said. And he's no tool of the Russians or anything like that. as I said, Biden made him the head of the CIA. And it came about then in 2014 that you had the Maidan protests, Maidan, in the square in central Kiev. And I won't go into the details about that, but the end effect was that the elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, was overthrown. Yanukovych represented this attempt to have Ukraine as an in-between country that straddled the world of the EU to its west and the world of Russia to its east. The whole Ukrainian economy at that time was mostly structured and functioned in the context of the Russian economy, supplying manufactured goods, raw materials and so forth. But the EU was insisting on an association agreement that excluded this eastern dimension. But then the EU got cold feet after what it had whipped up began to get out of control. There were forces involved on the Maidan protests, which were, let's put it mildly, were not liberal democratic elements. But the US intervened, as we know from the taped telephone conversation of Victoria Nuland. She famously said, if you excuse the language, fuck the EU. Yats is our man. And Yats was Yatsenuk, who thereafter became president, and the other personnel she also selected on that phone call also became the composition of the coup government. Now maybe, we can't really see it, but I mean it's very interesting both where the different ethnic groups are, if you like. I mean, you have on the extreme west of Ukraine an area called Galicia with Lvov or Lviv or Lemberg, whatever you want, as it's the main city, and which was for a long time part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At one time you had the Polish Empire, or Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, stretched right down. This is the Dnieper River. Can you see it? And in the east you had these areas which were part of Kiev Rus, and then of the forming Russian state. And there were intermittent attempts to establish a Ukrainian state, but it never got there. During the First World War, there was a Ukrainian state established at Lviv under the protectorate of the Germans and Austrians. But after the First World War, when all of that collapsed, during the mayhem of the Russian Civil War, as it's called, there were several factions, and the Ukrainian nationalists who believed in the Ukrainian nation state were by far the smallest of these. The great mass, the biggest movement in Ukraine those years went over to the Soviet forces and sought construction of a state within the Soviet Union. Crimea was not part of it at that time. That was given to Ukraine in 1954 by Khrushchev, who was himself from the region, because these boundaries didn't mean an awful lot in Soviet times. And then eventually, when the Soviet Union collapsed, both Gorbachev and Yeltsin were in favor of granting independence to Ukraine, but without the Donbass and Crimea. And no less a figure than Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a major supporter of this position. But the Soviets at that time were in no position to bargain. As I said, it was utter chaos reigning at the time. And so it came about that this extended state came about. Okay, what's very important in the period after 2014, you basically have war going on from then. The Ukrainian state made war after the establishment of this government. Populations in the Donbass, which is the big industrial area of Ukraine and still to this day generates most of the GDP of Ukraine, and the Crimea, with Russian assistance, rose up to oppose coming in under this government. The Ukrainian state, if you want to call it that, declared war on the Donbass, not actual war, but they sent 40,000 troops and shelled with artillery that area for that whole time, up to 2021. And in that period, according to the UN and the OSCE, 16,000 people died This is never mentioned anymore in Western reports. Okay. So it's interesting what happened then. There was the EU stepped in, and there were these Minsk agreements, and the Minsk agreements were supposed to grant a certain autonomy to the Donbass within the Ukrainian state, Crimea, that its status would be negotiated, and that Ukraine would not join NATO. These were the outline. This was the outline agreement, and it was support. This was happened under the patronage of Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, President Sarkozy of France, and they have all since said that they did not want this thing to be implemented. They had only signed it so as to gain time for Ukraine to arm itself and eventually establish its authority over these areas. And the president of that time, Poroshenko, said the exact same thing, that was the purpose of these agreements. But you can see in the elections that followed, you can see the divide that occurred. The most nationalist parties, all in the Galicia area, that's where they get their support, that's Poroshenko's base. Just uncompromising nationalists, and they go back to Stefan Bandera in World War II, and I suppose you all know that, who Stefan Bandera was allied with in the war, and where a lot of the recruits for the Ukrainian SS and all the rest of it came from over there. And this is part of the national identity promoted by these Western Ukrainians. It is one that people farther east in the country just have no identification with whatsoever. Most of the parties who wanted to maintain relations with Russia won majority in all the eastern areas of Ukraine, and not just in the Donbass, right over to the Dnieper and beyond. And famously, as we all know, when Volodymyr Zelensky was elected president in 2019, it was on a peace program, that he would bring peace with Russia and that he would implement the Minsk agreements. But after the election, that was very swiftly dropped, and it can only be assumed that he came under massive pressure from forces within the actual state to do so. And you have to remember that from this time there was a reaction from the West of increasing sanction pressure. There was anyone who's a sports person will know how Russia was gradually being squeezed out of sports competitions, and that was only the beginning of it. Sanctions against individuals, and this is going way back. This is since 2008. As has also begun to happen to Chinese leaders of one type or another. And these type of things, while it's very easy in a moment of heated emotion for Congress to pass sanctions, to get them lifted again is almost impossible. You've all seen that with the Iranian situation. A British Foreign Secretary 2 years ago said that the way things were fomenting in Ukraine, that it was about to become to Russia what the Afghanistan had been to the USSR. It would become what you call a glacis, that's that no man's land in front of castles in medieval warfare, where there'd just be unceasing conflict and to and fro and so on. And the RAND Corporation is a highly influential think tank in the States. There's a lot of consulting to the Pentagon, to presidents and so on. They published a study, they didn't publish it, but it has since become published, which was called Extending Russia. How do we stretch Russia to the point where it becomes fatally weakened? And interestingly enough, it included in its list of measures, economic measures, which was to break off the supplies of Russian gas to Europe, impose sanctions on the economy, encourage Russian brain drain, And in it, then it had geopolitical measures which it recommended. Supply lethal aid to Ukraine. These are exact quotes. And it believed that with the increasing tensions would gradually draw Russia in and weaken it both economically and politically, because this would force Russia to redouble its efforts to try and hold on to its what declining influence it had there. It also warned that Russia might respond by counter-escalating, including by sending troops into Donbass and so forth. And remember, this was all written in 2017. It also, by the way, just out of interest, has a load of other recommendations for other things to do in the world. Promote regime change in Belarus, exploit tensions in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan, reduce Russian influence in Kazakhstan, challenge the Russian presence in Moldova. And all of these measures, to a greater or lesser extent, have come to pass in one way or another since. Now, we could talk about the whole issue of democracy versus authoritarianism, and maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. Okay. There was the rising tensions during 2021, and this culminated, it included a build-up of Ukrainian forces on the contact line with Donbass. The Minsk agreements, as I said, had never been implemented, and the Russians moved forces into the east of that. Remember, Putin, who was quite a conservative leader, has always refused to recognize these autonomous areas which had declared themselves republics. And his position still was that they should be autonomous regions within Ukraine, which of course, no doubt, the Russians would exploit in one way or the other, but that was the position. And by the end of 2021, when there was no dialogue, in 17th of September, Putin sent a letter to Biden proposing 2 draft treaties for a security architecture for the future, agreement on the security architecture and the line of division between Russia and NATO, and demands that this be implemented without delay. He probably knew full well that this was completely unacceptable to the United States, as it was the indispensable nation. Okay, this wanted Ukraine to any renunciation of any enlargement of Ukraine, all American nuclear weapons to be withdrawn from Europe, and NATO forces to return to the 1997 borders. Okay, impossible probably, but a basis for negotiation possibly, and that both sides would agree not to deploy armed forces or armaments on territory of any other European state, and in addition that they would withdraw all nuclear weapons to their own countries, in other words the US or Russia. In essence, Putin was inviting the United States to reduce itself to the status of just another element of humanity, still a superpower, but just one among others. And this, of course, was not acceptable to the American view of the world that had come about since the 1990s. And in a sense, Ukraine didn't have to join NATO to become a member of NATO, because it was one, as Professor Mersheimer has said, it had already a de facto member in the extent that it was being equipped, trained already, and its whole strategic element organised by NATO, but without NATO having to enter a commitment to defend it. There was just a few events in January 2022 before the events. One was a humiliating meeting for Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, at which no one else was present except himself and Biden, and afterwards they came out and Biden declared that if Russia invades Ukraine, there will no longer be a Nord Stream 2 pipeline, we will bring it to an end. And this was the same message Victoria Nuland gave to the State Department. I want to be very clear to you today. If Russia invades Ukraine one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward. These are important. This is important because Nord Stream 2, as we see, was the essential element of the European integration with Russia essentially, but also with the whole of non-Russian Asia, which was taking place. Just a week or two after this event, Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, at Munich on the 19th of February, declared that the Budapest Agreement of 1994, withdrawing nuclear weapons from Ukraine, had been a mistake, saying that, and so on, and he wanted that what Ukraine needed was a nuclear umbrella. And if it couldn't get it through NATO, it would get it itself. This is the beginning of the idea of the alternatives of NATO membership, defending itself, or what would become known as the Israel option. Lavrov responded to this by saying that Zelensky, that Ukraine had now crossed Russia's red line. And days later, literally 5 days later, the 120,000 troops that the Russians had massed on the border moved into Ukraine. And just before that, there had been the Beijing Olympics, which of course the West was boycotting. I can't remember the particular reason at that time. And there was an extraordinary communique came out from Putin and Xi after it, denouncing the West for its pretensions to world hegemony and its ignoring of international law whenever it felt it in its interest to do so. Russia would support Chinese claims to its ancestral territory in Taiwan, and China supported Russian demands for an end to the expansion of NATO eastwards. Okay, just very briefly, the bifurcation, if you like, of the world that has taken place since that moment brooks no dissent. I don't think even in the Cold War I remember such a integrated media, such a lack of any possibility for discussing what is at stake and a suppressing of voices which have a contrary opinion. And what's been truly amazing is the extent to which civil society has allowed itself to be mobilised on this and behaved on this queue like a lynch mob. Private companies have gone beyond the call of duty in sanctioning all aspects of things Russian. I don't know if you see the hop on and hop off buses that go around Dublin city centre. You'll see the flags of the various voices. You can get the voiceover in for your guided tour, and there's a black blob in the middle. That's where the Russian flag was. This is the world we entered last February. Okay, and we know the sequence, we won't go over it. Russia recognised the breakaway republics for the first time. The response of the West was what Biden called sanctions from hell. Nothing in the history of the human history of the world heretofore compares with this economic war. What's also interesting is what came out. Biden let slip in announcing the sanctions on the 24th of February that these had been a long time in preparation. Quote, we have purposely designed these sanctions to maximise the long-term impact on Russia and to minimise the impact on the United States and its allies. And I want to be clear, the United States is not doing this alone. For months we have been building a coalition of partners representing more than half of the global economy. It's measured by GDP, not human people. And of course, as we know, to the shock of this great coalition against the evildoer, the great majority of the global south, of Africa, Asia and South America, refused to join in the sanctions regime. The EU declared ecstatically at the time that through the sanctions, Russia would be brought to its knees. Biden said the ruble will be rubble. The Nord Stream pipelines were stopped. Von der Leyen exclaimed that the Russian economy is in tatters. This was in April 2022. None of this has come to pass. The plan was, and what is the plan of sanctions? It is to immiserate the population so that they rise up and replace the government. And the EU falling into line with the American position is probably the most staggering development of the whole business. At one stage in those early days, the French finance minister was quoted in the Financial Times as saying, "We will provoke the collapse of the Russian economy. We are waging total economic and financial war against Russia, Putin and his government. And let's be clear, the Russian people will also pay the consequences." There was only one voice I came across in the Western world who cautioned, and that was Adam Tooze, who is otherwise a total enthusiast for the Western project. And he warned that sanctions would probably not work, as Russia had quietly over the previous years rebuilt itself economically, had its alternative trade routes, and had enormous reserves. And so it turned out to be. There were, I suppose what happened, people, like one of the things in the media that's compulsory to include when you say, you could not say special military operation, you have to say Russian invasion of Ukraine. And not only that, but it has to be the unprovoked, full-scale invasion. And the problem with this is that none of those adjectives apply. I've told you how it was provoked, and also it was not a full-scale invasion. A full-scale invasion is something like what the West did in Iraq. You bomb all the water supplies, you turn cities into deserts, you wreck them totally, and then you storm in with your armour. Russia did not, despite Western reports about indiscriminate bombing of cities, that did not happen. According to UN figures, the number of civilian casualties, although terrible in themselves, are very small for this type of a war. The casualties in this war are overwhelmingly troops on the front lines. The towns that are getting destroyed are ones that are being fought over in the east. People still go out and get a latte in Kiev. What's hit in places like Kiev, outside of sometimes bits of anti-aircraft missiles or whatever falling down and doing small amount of damage, what gets hit are military facilities and so forth, industrial facilities and so forth.
So who's dying over there with bombs? Who's being killed by the bombs? Sorry, they just had to come out with that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, who is dying bombs?
Who's being killed by the bombs then?
Well, I mean, what's incredible is you have 5 ballistic missiles hit some facility in the town, and the next day there might be sometimes no one killed. Sometimes they report 1 or 2 people killed. And the same on the other side. There's hardly a day goes by that there aren't shells landing on Donetsk city and Donbass. But the vast majority of the people who are being killed are soldiers. According to Western reports, they reckon there's been up to 500,000 casualties on the front lines at this stage, compared to about 10,000 civilians. Civilians are being killed. But compare that to Iraq or something, there's no comparison. It's the other way around. It's the civilians who die.
Perhaps we'll wait for the questions till later and then
we'll
leave a good hour for the questions.
Okay, and so initially I call it a feint or a political stab. There were these long columns drove up to Kiev. And they stopped outside Kiev, 25 to 40 kilometres outside. No one could work out what was happening. This was a column of about 40,000 troops. You did not take a city of 3 million people with 40,000 troops. It was a political feint. They moved these columns up and looked for a political response. They stayed put there, and then the Ukrainians went into action with enormous spirit, I must say, and began attacking these columns in type of guerrilla warfare type approach, and the Russians suffered bad losses on of both men and equipment. But nevertheless, a line of negotiation was opened in Istanbul, and it seemed that some type of heads of agreement, though whether they were complete enough I don't know, had come about and had been signed by both sides. And Putin, he called his goodwill gesture, withdrew forces from around Kiev and that northern area. The idea that there was a battle of Kiev and a glorious defence and a big defeat is really mythology. But then immediately after this agreement was initialed, the first surprise visit to Kiev by a Western leader happened with Boris Johnson. And according to Fiona Hill, who is a leading political commentator in America, again in the type of Washington policy world, and she wrote an article in Foreign Policy which said that had come out that what Boris said to Zelensky was basically hold out, fight to the last, the West will be fully behind you, will arm you to the teeth, and you'll win. But if you compromise, you're on your own. And it was after that that the Ukrainians pulled out of those talks, and it came out a couple of weeks later, one of their main negotiators was assassinated, which the Ukrainian Secret Service later claimed responsibility for on the basis that that person was a traitor. There's a lot of these assassinations go on that are rarely reported. And if you like, then you had all these atrocity stories. Briefly, we haven't had many since, but we did at that time, about what happened in Bucha and so on. And the effect of that was just that a continuation of these talks became possible. So that was the first phase, if you like, and it was after that Russia withdrew. It consolidated what it occupied against no resistance, it must be said, across the south, the land bridge to Crimea, a big swathe of territory to Nikolaev. And we all know during the summer of 2022 it turned into this grinding industrial war at the front lines. And eventually in the autumn there were two Ukrainian counter-offensives. It was a very thinly held area up in the north, east of Kharkiv, and the Russians vacated it, and the Ukrainians filled the territory. There was virtually no fighting except in two towns, Izium and Liman, where the Russians moved in to extricate their garrisons. And something similar, there was actually heavy fighting in Kherson in the south when the Ukrainians did a counterattack. And the Russians eventually decided to pull their army out of there across the Dnieper to stop them being cut off, which was carried out overnight and with virtually no casualties. And if you like, this was the high period of Western triumphalism. But in fact, things seemed to be going well for Ukraine, but in fact it was the other way around. The Russians consolidated themselves, built these enormous defences, but there were things going on like the hitting of the Kerch Bridge, which was jubilantly reported in the Western media, and other events like that, the blowing of the Antonovsky Bridge, the collapse of the Kharkova Dam, and so on. And Zelensky declared his position that there could be no compromise with Russia, certainly not, there could be no negotiations with Putin. There had to be a change of government, Russia had to withdraw to 1991 boundaries, and there had to be war crimes trials and reparations. It was a demand for a Russian capitulation. It was not going to happen. Rishi Sunak issued a joint declaration with Zelensky committing totally to his war aims. So So basically the Western narrative that Russia was isolated internationally crumbled at this time, particularly as events took place internationally which strengthened Russia's position. There were no more United Nations General Assembly resolutions because the West could not summon majorities for them anymore. And the catastrophe for Ukraine was only beginning, really. You had 9 million people streamed out of the country, and what's often forgotten is 2.5 million of them went eastward, not to the European Union. And also, it has to be said, according to CSO figures, 20% of the people leaving the country are men of military age who just do not want to end up in this meat grinder. And also, according to surveys I've seen both in Ireland by the CSO and in Germany, that there's now up to 60% of Ukrainians are not planning to return anytime soon. So a country that had a population of 50 million around 1990 in Soviet times is probably at this stage under control of the Kiev government little over 20 million. That's a catastrophic development for the country. And the Americans were getting worried at this time. There was another RAND report called Avoiding a Long War, and it was why America had to bring this to an end in some form, as it was losing momentum in confronting what really is its one single strategic competitor and antagonist, which is China. It suggested that Ukraine should forget about getting all its territory back and cut some deal and allow the Americans get on with taking on the Chinese. Biden even came out weekly to say that the role of American support for Ukraine, which at this stage, Western support for Ukraine is in 1 year has been more than the entire GDP of Ukraine in the preceding year. But that this support, the purpose of it, no longer talking about a big victory, but this purpose of it is to strengthen Ukrainian hand in negotiations. So the West was now under retreat from its original position. Russian economy had bounced back and so forth. And it should be remembered that Russia, although it's only half the population of the United States, its education system turns out twice as many engineers every year. What has really shocked Western economic opinion has been how Russia has been able to have this incredible industrial base which has revived and which is immune to sanctions and which is churning out war material at an extraordinary level. Meanwhile, on the world stage, China brought about a peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, an extraordinary event. And what is never mentioned is that that also ended the Yemen war, in which more people have been killed than were killed in Ukraine. So China is emerging as this international peacemaker, an extraordinary role for it. And we're now in the situation of this great counter-offensive on which so many hopes were based, and that with NATO tactics and NATO intelligence and NATO equipment, these would smash through the land bridge to Crimea. And the results have been terrible, really terrible for Ukraine. Some tiny slivers of land and about 9 villages, and at a casualty rate which even Western sources now say are border on the catastrophic. A third of all the NATO stuff has been destroyed and so forth. But there was a very upbeat report by David Ignatius in the Washington Post. This is all good for America, basically, is what he said. What David Ignatius wrote, meanwhile for the United States and its NATO allies, these 18 months of war have been a strategic windfall at relatively low cost, brackets, other than for the Ukrainians. The West's most reckless antagonist has been rocked. NATO has grown much stronger with the addition of Sweden and Finland. Germany has weaned itself from dependence on Russian energy and in many ways rediscovers its sense of values. Overall, this has been a triumphal summer for the alliance. And the biggest outcome of all this in the rest of the world, if you like, has been, it was taking place at the same time, this autumn, the BRICS conference in South Africa. There was the Prigozhin mutiny in Russia, the headbanger, the Michael O'Leary of the Wagner group. And what the West realised was that the potential for destabilising Russia did not lie in its liberal Democrats, who were, if anything, supportive of the war, but in extreme nationalists who complained about Putin not prosecuting the war the way the Americans would do. And that it was right-wing nationalists were the alternative if Putin was brought down. But still, they thought you could see by the reporting in the West that they were jubilant over this Wagner affair. But to the Russians, what the Wagner mutiny exposed was the essential anti-Russian trajectory of Western policy and why it was waging war in Ukraine. What was revealed was that the objective for the West was the disintegration of Russia, not its democratization. By the end of the year, Western media were beginning to look for, was there an angle on freezing this conflict, a Korean-style settlement, etc., etc. But these type of things are not going to be accepted by Russia. We also see in terms of casualties that there's been, while in the early period when those long columns, exposed columns were being attacked, the Russians took very heavy casualties. But this year, all of this year, it has been the Ukrainians who've been paying an awful blood toll. There was a meeting recently between Zaluzhny, the American head of the military, whatever his official title, Milley, and the British. Just shows you the British are still in there, playing the divide and rule role they always have. And it's interesting, the British person was an Admiral Godkin, and it's particularly interesting that he's an admiral, because we were back to this issue that what the West wanted was Sevastopol and Crimea. They tried to convince Zaluzhny, give up all that stuff about retaking Bakhmut or these other places further north, all forces to the south, threaten to break the bridge. And what was Zaluzhny's response to these people and the way they ordered him to wage war? Zaluzhny is Commander-in-Chief of Ukrainian forces. In exasperation, he said to them, "This is not a counterinsurgency, this is Kursk." I don't know if you know your history of World War II. It was the biggest battle of World War II, thousands of tanks and the Russians with huge defensive lines that smashed the German reserves and turned the history of the war, basically. But what Zaluzhny was referring to was, this is what we are attacking into on your recommendation, as a brick wall of extraordinary Russian defences which are being defended with extraordinary skill. But still the West keeps trying to keep the pot boiling. We've had farcical incidents like this clear out of all the recruitment officers, the head of every recruitment officer in Ukraine, on the basis of an anti-corruption drive. It just says something about what type of a state Zelensky's trying to rule. We could get into what does explain EU behaviour, and I'd be happy to, but I'm sure we're close on time. So, but it's one of the extraordinary events of this whole thing is the collapse of Europe, and it needs to be explained, and the deindustrialisation of Germany, and so on. John Mersheimer, who was a leading figure in American political thought, often had articles in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, all the rest of it, lectured at Johns Hopkins University, But since he's taken a slightly offbeat line on all of this, you see him less and less in the mainstream media. But recently he said, if you look at the run-up to the war in early 22, what is really striking is that it was quite clear that war was at least a serious possibility. Yet the United States and the West more generally did virtually nothing to try to prevent that war. If anything, we egged the Russians on. I find it hard to imagine what was going on here, and I think we believed that if a war broke out, we had trained up the Ukrainians sufficiently that they could hold on to the battlefield, and that we felt our magic weapon was sanctions, that we'd finish Russia off, knock it out of the ranks of the great powers, and the Ukrainians would end up defeating the Russians on the field, and then they would be in a position to be brought into NATO. I think that's spot on. But for Russia, there's now no going back. They have to complete their objectives here or capitulate. Okay, I think we've finished that up. But just to recall what's going on in the wider world, and I mentioned it and we can get into it, is the rise of this BRICS entity, which would never have happened and never of such importance except for this whole context. The whole world is being recreated anew. This is as radical a change as what happened in 1991 or previously in 1945-50. People I don't think they grasp the extent to which their lives is being and their world is being changed. And the emergence of the global south and all that is a huge consequence of it. And I just want to reiterate what I said at the start very briefly. Sorry, Catherine. That the war in Ukraine was brought about for geopolitical reasons by Western policy, which is US policy. And it created what for Russia, what they saw, and that's all that matters, as an existential threat, which would have forced Russia back into Asia. And this is what they responded to. The conflict, which had started in 2014, Russia responded to with its Special Military Operation 2022. West Ukrainian nationalists have managed to impose a very narrow type of nationalist view on the Ukrainian state, which a lot of the population are uncomfortable with, but that's the entity they must function with. So as I said, the outcome of this, if it doesn't end, or if there are not talks very soon, and we see nothing arising in Europe to help try to bring that about, is a terrible fate for Ukraine. It will be wrecked as a state. And secondly, the other thing emerging from it is the remaking of the global order.
Many thanks to Philip. Whether we agree or disagree with Philip, it's important that he has given us another narrative. And I must say, as a TD in the Dáil, I have despaired over the consensus mentality that has persisted in relation to the Ukraine war. Let me just say that at the beginning. And I want to thank the hard-working committee for organising this weekend, and for this is the last session today with Philip, and it's particularly important for me as a TD, and I think for all of us, that we're allowed here alternative views. I remember the Nyberg report in relation to the banking inquiry, and what stood out for him was the consensus mentality that led to the banking crisis and many other reasons, and it's been repeated here with terrible consequences. And in the Dáil, we continuously, like a refrain in the rosary, we have to say and deplore the invasion of Russia. Let me say personally, I have no difficulty deploring the invasion of Russia. It shouldn't have happened. But we have to use up valuable speaking time. Sometimes we have 2 or 3 minutes, and we have to give the refrain so that we're not accused of being Putin's puppets. So I want to personally thank Philip today and the school. And there's a full hour for questions and